Thank you very much for giving up your evening and hearing me address this question, how does science fit with faith? And my answer used to be, when I was 18 and quite confident as an atheist, I used to think it doesn't. How can the two possibly go together? In fact, in my first year at Cambridge, I wrote a poem to express my contempt for religion. It wasn't a very good poem because I was studying science, not English, but I do still remember it. It's very short, and it goes like this. Some folk seem to find it odd that people grow from tiny cells. Pathetic, those who think. Summary of religion as I saw it. How naive of people still to believe in God after so many advances in science. I mean, sure, people used to believe that God made it rain with a big watering can in the sky. But then we came to understand about evaporation and condensation, the water cycle. People used to think that you got ill because of evil spirits and you got better because of miracles. But then we came to understand about viruses and bacteria and the human immune system. Surely now we've put human beings on the moon, now we've sequenced the human DNA, it's time to set aside these naive superstitions. And I thought maybe Christians just don't understand. They've been left behind by science. They don't realise. Maybe they're still superstitious on a level with someone who throws money into a well on holiday and makes a wish and honestly expects tomorrow to turn out differently. Whereas, of course, I knew as an enlightened 18-year-old that actually the local council comes along and harvests all the money and it just goes into the local coffers. About 2 months after writing that poem, I became a Christian. I won't go into the whole story, and you'll be pleased to know I didn't write any poetry to celebrate. But again, similarly to Keith, I for the first time met Christians at university who didn't fit my stereotype of religious people. I thought Christians were, and I wasn't this rude to their face, but privately, I thought they were gullible hypocrites. Gullible because I never heard a serious reason why I should believe it. Hypocrites because, well, I read the same scandals you do about the paedophiles in the priesthood, etc. I wanted nothing to do with it until I met Christians who didn't fit that stereotype. They weren't gullible, many of them much more intelligent than I was and thought through. And they weren't hypocrites. They really lived out their relationship with Jesus Christ in a way that was very compelling and made me very curious. And I investigated it and asked all sorts of questions and basically became convinced and became a Christian. And at that point, I became one of the things that the modern secularist says that you can't be. I became a both-and person. The secularists are always urging us that it's got to be one or the other. I mean, if you want to be a sort of emotional person who believes that are nice even though there's no evidence for them, and you want, good for you, well done, that's fine. Or, alternatively, you can be a rational person and believe in evidence and think things through. But you certainly can't be both. These are chalk and cheese. And I became both. I became a science student who was also a Christian. Now, I was in good company because actually some of the great household names of the history of science were both and people. People like, start with an easy one, Isaac Newton. Actually, even though we're in a whole lecture, so let's do some audience participation. So shout out if you know what these scientists are famous for. So Isaac Newton. Gravity, brilliant. Michael Faraday. It's a very well-educated audience. It's excellent. I am, after all, speaking in a science research facility. So, Louis Pasteur, pasteurization, bacteria. I once was speaking to students and somebody shouted out milk. And no, he didn't invent milk, but he worked out the reason milk goes off is because the organism's too small for us to see. He hypothesized the existence of bacteria. How about Charles Babbage? First mechanical computer. Yeah. Robert Boyle, Keith will know this from his chemistry degree, the annoying Boyle's gas laws you had to learn if you did A-level chemistry. All of them committed believers in Jesus Christ and the leading scientists of their day. Well, you might say, well, yeah, okay, but just everyone was a Christian, back in the 17th, 18th century. But according to a leading historian of science, Sir Alfred North Whitehead, there's more of a connection between those two facts than that. He observes that people sought for law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. It was the fact that they believed that the world was intelligently created that they went to look for intelligibility in the world. If people had believed, as many do today, that the world is entirely accidental, it's whether they would have bothered trying to understand it. Why research something you're expecting to just be random and look for patterns? But they weren't expecting it to be random. They were expecting it to make sense because they thought an intelligent God had made it. More reliable. I think I'm coming in and out. Thank you. So what about now? We've made advances in science, strides forward. Surely now it's impossible to be a both and person, isn't it? Well, we've just heard from a very eminent scientist that he's a both and. Remember the first week that I became a Christian in Cambridge, I went to church and sat next to somebody with an appropriately professorial looking beard. And sure enough, he was a professor, Professor Bob White, Professor of Geophysics at Cambridge University. Which is odd, isn't it? Because people tell you that, of course, you can't believe in the Bible because of the dates and the fossils, and yet Professor Bob White knows more about geology than most people in the world, and somehow manages to combine it with a belief in Jesus. What about the evolution? You may know that the same year that Richard Dawkins published The God Delusion, a man called Francis Collins, who was the chairman of the Human Genome Project, the international community of scientists working to sequence human DNA, he published his book explaining his faith in Jesus Christ. One of my best friends, actually, is now a senior lecturer in evolutionary biology at Queen Mary University and a Christian. It just doesn't seem to be an either. Of course, I'm not saying that every excellent scientist is a Christian. There's plenty of excellent scientists who are atheists or whatever else. I am arguing it can't be a simple either or. There are too many both and people. And my suggestion is that is because there is no contradiction at all between science and the teaching of Jesus Christ. I just don't think there is a contradiction. Now, that's as long as you're objective and fair in the way that you define science. Of course, it is possible to set up the question so that the only kind of observations you count as being scientific have to be based on atheism, but then you just put atheism at the beginning and you get atheism out at the end. If we're more neutral, more objective, what is science? It's basically a methodology where you observe the world, you formulate a hypothesis to explain what you've observed, and then you test that hypothesis by experiments. There's nothing about that methodology that means you've got to be an atheist to use it. In fact, scientific papers don't even distinguish whether a particular experiment was done by a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian or an atheist. It doesn't matter because we're using the same method. The method isn't intrinsically atheistic. Nor do I know anything that's been discovered by that method that contradicts anything in the Bible. I just don't think that conflict exists. However, very obviously there is a conflict, which is probably why you're here tonight, because it's a hot topic, right? I want to suggest actually the conflict isn't between science and Christianity, but rather between atheism and Christianity. Two different belief systems, two different philosophies that people bring to their science or that inform their understanding of the world. Now, of course, an atheist probably get quite annoyed at me calling their system a belief system, but I think that's what it is. It's interesting, even as you read a book like The God Delusion, how many times Richard Dawkins will make an assertion or say, I cannot accept such and such, without giving experimental results. Lots of presuppositions, lots of philosophical starting points that we bring to our science, atheist ones or Christian ones, and they are very much in conflict with each other. I want to suggest science is a tool that both of us can use, and actually we ought to ask ourselves, which one of these theories, which one of these belief systems makes most sense of the evidence that science tells us? That's what I'm going to try and do this evening. So firstly, let me outline them both, and then I'm going to compare them in three ways, and then I'm done. It's over to you to grill me. So firstly, atheism, or sometimes it's called naturalism, is a philosophy that says that matter and chance are all that there is. So Carl Sagan, the cosmologist, in a parody of the Bible statement that God was and is to come, Carl Sagan says, no, the cosmos was and is to come. All there ever has been, all there ever will be, is just the cosmos, just the material world. In the words of Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, mankind is nothing but a chance collocation of atoms on a minor speck of interstellar dust. Well, as a scientist, I agree with him that we're made up of atoms, and it seems pretty obvious that the Earth is a relatively unimpressive planetary body in an average solar system in a vast galaxy that's one of many, many galaxies. But the key words for Bertrand Russell are that we are no more than, that we're nothing but that. We are reducible to that. We are only the matter that we're comprised of and the chance that put it in this existing conformation. Go slightly more depressing, you have to cross the channel and meet the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. And he said, translated into English, every living being was born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. Don't imagine he was much fun to have round for dinner, but there we are. It is just random. That's all it is. Or in my own field of neuroscience, Francis Crick, who got the Nobel Prize for the DNA double helix structure, went on to do neuroscience. And he wrote in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, he puts it in inverted commas because he's not sure quite how much sense he can make of personality. But the apparent you, your joys and sorrows, your sense of personal ambition and free will, are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Now, as a neuroscientist, I agree with him that our thoughts are bound up with the movement of electrons in our brain. But again, notice those words. We are no more than that. There's no spirit, no soul, no God, only the physical, and everything can be reduced to that. That's the atheist view. Now, the Christian view is very, very different to that. And rather than just giving you my own version of the Christian view, I thought I'd give you an excerpt from the Bible itself, and in particular from a speech that the Apostle Paul, one of Jesus' personally appointed representatives, a speech he gave in first century Athens. Now, Athens was the intellectual capital of the day, where the greatest minds met to debate the latest ideas. And we're told in particular that Paul got speaking to some Epicurean philosophers. The Epicureans believed that life was down to chance and there was no survival beyond the grave. So in some ways they were equivalent to modern day atheist naturalists. And this is how Paul explains the Christian alternative. You've got a little excerpt on a piece of paper somewhere near you, and we're on the side that begins, the God who made, if you want to follow along. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. Let's stop there. Just 2 sentences in, I wonder if you can see that in some ways Christianity and atheism are exactly the opposite of each other. Let me explain. If you were to say to an atheist like Richard Dawkins, does God exist? He would say no, or he'd say probably not, which turns out, I think, just to be a more sophisticated way of saying no. But if you were to say, does Christianity exist? He'd say, well, of course it does. I'm not ignorant about this global phenomenon where over 1 billion people worship this guy, Jesus Christ. Oh, well, Richard Dawkins, can you explain where Christianity came from? Of course. People made it up. So for the atheist, chance produced a human being, and human beings produced in their imaginations a God. Randomness came up with us, we came up with the divine. I wonder if you can see that is precisely the opposite of what Paul says about the world. The God who made the world and everything in it, he's not served by human hands, he's not dependent on human beings for his existence. We are dependent on him for our existence. He gives all men life and breath and everything. 2 very, very different views of reality. And the question is, which one makes most sense of the facts? That's the question any scientist ought to ask. I want to compare them in 3 different ways. Number 1, the first one's the longest, by the way, so if you're timing, they're going to get quicker. The first one, design. Of course, very controversial word, because lots of people don't think the world is designed, it's just random. But everyone at least agrees the world looks designed. The idea that, people in the lecture theatre listening to English language and processing in their brains came about entirely by accident is intuitively kind of unlikely. the astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle, once said that the idea of life as we know it emerging by chance from a primordial slunge seemed to him intrinsically unlikely. And he compared it to the scenario where a whirlwind passes through a junkyard and leaves behind a fully assembled functioning 747 aircraft. I mean, it's sort of theoretically possible, isn't it, that all the bits of the junkyard just sort of blade themselves together into an aircraft that can then take off and fly to New York. But it just doesn't seem like the most obvious explanation for the existence of this aircraft. However, there is a comeback. Atheists like Richard Dawkins say evolution solves all of our problems. Here is a quote from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which was required reading when I went up to university all those years ago. He says this: design is only apparent. We have a mechanism to account for it, natural selection. The blind, unconscious, automatic process, which we now know is the explanation for the existence of and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind, no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is that of the blind watchmaker. So there we are. So Richard Dawkins says that the idea that we came back with some kind of purpose or reason is just an illusion played on us by this mechanistic process of natural selection, evolution. I want to take issue with that for a moment. Even if you accept that the process of evolution is all that you need to get from a single-celled ancestor billions of years ago to a fully self-conscious human being capable of love and understanding and cognitive awareness, all those sorts of things. Even if you think that that's all that's needed, which it's worth saying goes far, far further than anything that's been remotely demonstrated in the laboratory, you've still got a problem. Because even to get evolution started, you first have to have an information-carrying, self-replicating molecule that can pass on information to its children. That's the basis of natural selection, is inherited characteristics. The simplest one we know of is RNA, which is one of the most complex molecules known to chemistry. So where did the RNA come from? And even more problematically, where do you get the information from encoded on that RNA to build even the simplest self-replicating cell? Actually, the problems get even bigger, because not only do you have to have RNA with information to build something extraordinarily complex, you've also got to have a universe for that RNA to exist in. And that, I think, gives atheists a huge headache for two reasons. The first one is the fact that the universe is here at all. I want to share with you an argument that's known as the Kalam cosmological argument. I rather like the name because it sounds like something in a comic strip, doesn't it? Kapow, Kaspaz, and Kalam. Well, it's the word Kalam, K-A-L-A-M. And the argument goes like this: everything that began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Deduction: the universe must have a cause. Let me explain. You don't have to explain in science things that don't change. If you say, how come those flowers are still on the table when they were on the table earlier? It's not an interesting question, is it? They're on the table because they were on the table and no one's moved them. Whereas, if the flowers are suddenly taken over here, and someone comes in and says, how come the flowers that were on the table are now on the floor? And I say, I don't know, it just happened. Maybe they just sort of vaporized and went over there. As a scientist, you wouldn't be very satisfied with that, would you? You think there must be a cause for something that's changed. Things that don't change don't require explanation. Things that do change do need to be explained. Well, people used to think, until only 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, that the universe was eternal. It's always been here. And if it's always been here, you don't have to explain it. Why is the universe here? Well, it's here because it was here. And why was it here? Well, it was here because it was here before that. You don't have to explain something, it doesn't change. But now the scientific community agrees that the universe has a beginning in the finite past, so-called Big Bang theory. That is a huge problem for the atheists. Because if it didn't used to exist and now it does exist, what caused the change? You can't just say, well, it just happened, like the flowers just, there they are. You've got to explain it. It's a real problem. The Big Bang theory is a massive own goal for the atheists. Firstly, that there is a universe at all. Secondly, that there is this universe so carefully, finely tuned to make life possible. Here are some numbers I ought to say these aren't special Christian numbers, in case you're suspicious of it. These are mainstream science numbers, okay? So scientists agree about these numbers. If the ratio of the electromagnetic force constant to the gravitational force constant were increased or decreased by 1 part in 10 to the 40, we'd have a universe containing either only big stars, too hot to sustain life, or only small stars, too cold to manufacture chemical elements. If the ratio of the expansion and contraction forces acting just after the Big Bang had altered by as little as 1 part in 10 to the 55, then the universe would either have expanded too quickly so that no galaxies formed, or too slowly so that it quickly collapsed. Unless our universe fell within a very tiny volume of the phase space of possible universes, corresponding to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123, then there could not be a second law of thermodynamics. In other words, this is very, 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 very unlikely. If you want an analogy, one of my friends calculated that if you were to take a continent the size of America and cover it with 5 penny pieces tessellated to cover the whole surface of the continent, and then stack them to a depth of the distance between here and the moon, 380,000 kilometres away, and then did the same for a billion other continents that size, painted one of the 5 pieces red with nail varnish, blindfold your wife, your husband, get him or her to pick one at random, that's about 1 in 10 to the 55. In other words, it's very unlikely. And the atheist has to say, well, I guess the universe got lucky. And I want to say that is too lucky. That requires too much faith. Now, of course, as I say, these are mainstream numbers. Everyone knows about the problem. The recent comeback has been to say, well, in that case, maybe there is a multiverse. Maybe there are infinitely many universes. Because if you do the same experiment infinitely many times, then one of them is going to get lucky. The trouble with the multiverse theory is it isn't really a scientific theory, because you can't observe it, or repeat it, or test it. You can just believe it. You can believe it by faith, because the data tells you this is very improbable, and you can say, well, I'm going to believe in a multiverse to explain it. Or you could say the universe is very improbable. I'm going to believe in an intelligent creator who chose the numbers. But both of us are trusting something to explain the numbers. Actually, when it comes to it, I think the multiverse makes very little sense. And if there's infinitely many universes, that means that nothing is surprising. The Big Bang's not surprising, but neither is anything else. As well as the universe in which these two ladies are sitting that way round, with the lady with the spots on the right and the lady with the plain t-shirt on the left. There's the universe in which they're sitting the other way round. There's also the universe in which one of them has a hat. There's also the universe in which I drop dead now. No, we're not in that one. You might be disappointed to hear. Everything that's happened to you today also hasn't happened to you in every possible permutation somewhere else in the multiverse. Now, this is starting to really stretch my imagination as something to believe by faith. Or you could follow the data and say it almost looks like someone picked the numbers. Maybe the same person who explains why the universe exists at all. The one who made the Big Bang go bang and chose the expansion rate so that we could have planets, and made RNA so that we could have biological characteristics inherited generation by generation, and created human beings with the miracle of consciousness and all of those things. Paul says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. He himself gives all men life and breath and everything. It starts to fit quite well with the data. So I told you that was the longest. Design 2 more briefly. Secondly, which one makes most sense of human life? Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not going to argue now that Christianity must be true because it's nicer, although it is nicer. Rather, I just want to challenge you gently, if you're here as an atheist, that you might not be living out what you believe consistently. And I think that's a problem. I think if you say you believe something that you cannot live by, that is a problem. I used to actually hate that about religious people. I used to hate hypocrisy. You know, where they say one thing and then they do another. I hated that. And if you hate religious hypocrisy, you're in really good company, because Jesus Christ couldn't stand it. Actually, what I'd never noticed as an atheist throwing stones at the Christians was that I was guilty of atheistic hypocrisy, because I wasn't living out my own belief system consistently. John Gray, the professor of European thought at the LSE, wrote a book called Straw Dogs. It's not a Christian book, but he challenges atheists for failing to follow their conclusions through logically. He says, we are just a lucky throw in the cosmic lottery. And as such, we must realise that we live in a world that is as indifferent to our sufferings as it is to our hopes and our crimes. In other words, a random universe doesn't care. It's just random. Good and evil aren't real categories. They're just labels given to random. Suffering doesn't matter. It's just random. During my PhD, I often used to get a hard time for being the Christian in the lab, and people used to tease me, and in good nature. And one day I asked Kate, one of the professors, and you must understand we were good friends. This was for the sake of argument. It sounds a bit chilling with hindsight, but I said to her, Kate, tell me, according to your philosophy, why killing you would be wrong. It wasn't said aggressively, just a thought experiment. Why would killing you be wrong? In particular, why would it be any different to me just cutting a grapefruit in half for my breakfast? Because all I'd be doing in both cases is just rearranging the atoms of the universe in a slightly different way. Kate atoms, grapefruit atoms, much the same proportion of carbon, and so on. She thought about it. She said, the difference is my mother would be upset. But I said, but Kate, what's upset? Upset is just the decrease in the concentration of the chemical serotonin in the randomly assembled collection of atoms, which is your mother's brain. Why does that matter? And she couldn't tell me why it mattered. Now, of course, she knows it matters. Kate's a very nice lady. She lived a moral life, a very kind life. It just wasn't consistent with what she said that she believed about the world. And I think that's a problem. Whereas Christianity can account for the fact that we are personal and that we sense that relationships matter and that murder is wrong and all of those things, because we're told here that human life is purposeful. It was made by a creator God, and it was purposeful. Look at middle of the first paragraph. God made us, verse 27, so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. We are made in order to relate to the God who made us. Morality matters because he is a moral God. He loves life, he hates murder. Truth matters because he is an honest God. He loves truth, he hates lies. People matter because he is a personal, relational God, and he's made us in his image. Relationships matter because he wants us to know him. Now, this is a problem, though, isn't it? Because even though science is very powerful, science cannot tell us everything that is important. I really want you to go away with this today. Even though science is very powerful, it cannot tell you everything that's important. I went head-to-head with Professor Peter Atkins recently. He's an atheist professor at Oxford, much brighter than me. But he was defending, I thought, an extraordinary claim. He said, rational people should not accept anything that is not proved by scientific experiment. That was his claim. And I thought, you don't believe that for a minute. So I asked the question quite cheekily. I said, Professor Atkins, can you tell us who was speaking at the podium before you were? And you could ask me that question and say it was a man called Keith with the Nobel Prize. And we all knew the answer. He knew the answer. But he couldn't prove it with a scientific experiment. But there had just been about 200 witnesses who witnessed it. Science is powerful. It's not the only kind of useful data. It's not the only way of knowing things that are true. And in particular, science isn't very good when it comes to getting to know people. Imagine you wanted to get to know me, and all you had to go on with what you could find out using scientific experiments. Here I am. You can do experiments on me. What could you tell? You could do gas chromatography under my armpit. You could tell me what deodorant I'm wearing and whether it's coping with this slightly stressful situation that I'm in right now. You could do DNA fingerprinting. You could work out whether I'm likely to die young of any known genetic illness. And I am. My paternal side has a history of heart disease. That's about all you could tell. You couldn't tell my name. You couldn't tell really anything of any importance to me as a person. what makes me laugh, what makes me cry, who I love and care about, what I would die for. Science is powerful, it just can't tell you everything that's important, which is why I very much doubt, if you're here today in a relationship, I very much doubt on your first date, you said, please can I take a small DNA sample, I'll run some tests, and I'll be back with you with an answer within the week. It's just not how it works, is it? To know people, you've got to meet people and find out who they are and what they're like. Well, if that's the problem just with another human being, how much bigger the problem when it comes to the God who made us? How could you know him by experiments? If he's everywhere, how could you exclude him from the apparatus to take a null reading as a control? God, please could you just leave the world for a second? We'll see if the readings change on our instruments. You just can't do that kind of experiment. And we would be in the dark, except that God has decided to make himself known to us, to introduce himself to us. And we're told here at the end of paragraph 2, extraordinary claim to find about Christianity. God has set a day, sentence 31, God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He's given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. Maybe there'll be the same reactions here today. But what a surprise to find that word proof in the Bible. I was very surprised by that as an atheist. See, I thought that science was about facts and evidence, and faith was about your imagination, if you were gullible. Very surprised to find the category of evidence and proof over here on the Christian side. God never asks you in the Bible, I can't find anywhere in the Bible where God asks people to believe something without giving them a reason for it and grounds for it. And here he's saying you ought to change your mind about God because he's going to judge the world, and he's given proof by raising the judge from the dead. Now, when it comes to the resurrection, I looked it up in the index of the God Delusion, Richard Dawkins' book, and he mentions the resurrection only once to say it either happened or didn't happen. Well, I agree with that much. He then says it can't have happened, being by nature of the case a violation of the laws of science. But actually that isn't how science works. You don't have a scientific theory and hold on to it in the face of the anomalous result. Well, the anomalous result causes you to re-examine your theory and say, this doesn't quite fit. Maybe my theory's got to change. See, for Richard Dawkins, he's already decided, he's pre-decided about the resurrection, that there can't be one, because he's pre-decided about the universe that there is no God. He's pre-decided about humanity that we are only matter and chance. And if all of his preconceptions are right, a resurrection would be impossible. But what if there was a resurrection? He says, no, there wasn't. You don't even need to look at the evidence. I've already decided. But what if there was? Then you'd have to look for a different theory to make sense of everything. Such as the kind of universe that was created by an intelligent God, which is why it exists. Who made the Big Bang go bang at exactly the right speed and put exactly the right information in the RNA, the DNA, so that we could exist. And made us personal and moral and relational because he wants to know us personally. And came into the world in the person of Jesus Christ and really wanted us to know for sure that it was him. And so he burst through the grave and rose from the dead. That would be evidence, I think, if you were to follow it where it led, that ought to lead you to change your mind. Thank you for listening. Questions, I think in a moment we can take a brief pause and then you get a chance to grill me.